Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the BC Poly Hot Stove. I'm live from Metrotown in beautiful Burnaby, British Columbia. Jordan Bateman, Vice President Communications for the Independent Contractors and Businesses Association, joined as always by...
Well, I'm Maclean K. I'm the editor-in-chief of the mighty and scoop-bringing Orca.
That's right.
Coming to you from the slightly less beautiful, gray and rainy legislature in Victoria.
It's just an honor to know it's still standing, the legislature in Victoria. I wait for that 2.1 Richter scale earthquake, which will drastically reduce the size of government overnight.
It won't take a Notre Dame to bring this place down. That's true.
Yeah, exactly. That is very true. Well, Maclean on the front burner, on the front page. Look at this. I have a prop. Oil and water, which is a great headline. Well done, folks.
Oh, that is a good headline.
Well done, folks of the Vancouver province. Oil and water. Jason Kenney versus John Horgan. It could be quite the brawl, says our friend Smitty. Smitty loves a good political brawl, so that doesn't surprise me that he would say that. Yeah, so let's talk about the big issue that British Columbians and Canadians in general should be talking about today. It is the big return of the Conservative Party to power in Alberta. Well,
and I mean, the first thing we should say is if you're surprised, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you haven't been reading the polls too closely, or you've been in an airtight social media bubble. I mean, you can be dismayed or happy. It doesn't. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if this surprised you, then you were either reading the wrong people or not paying close attention. As for what's going to happen, well, Kenney's been pretty clear. He's going to do what Notley threatened to do, he says, which is to, what was his line? He's going to make Vancouver carbon free by 2020, which again, love him or hate him, that's a pretty good line.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a sort of torn on this because obviously I'm a British Columbian who ended up paying higher gas prices if the taps are turned off. There's a lot of talk that, it's illegal to turn off the taps. I actually think that's part of Kenney's plan is, great, tell me it's illegal to turn off the taps. Then it's probably illegal for you to say no to a pipeline. Like, you can't have it both ways. But anyways, I've been thinking about this a lot over the last couple of days, and we'll get back to the Alberta election and kind of what happened there in a second. But, I'm a proud Canadian, and, I consider myself a Canadian first. And at times, being a Canadian means, you actually have to put your provincial interests secondary to the overall national interest from time to time. And I don't think there's any doubt that, a pipeline to Tidewater is absolutely in the national interest. So much so that the Trudeau Liberals actually flip-flopped on their promise on this. Even they realized that this is of paramount importance in an era where Energy East couldn't get built and Keystone couldn't get built and Northern Gateway couldn't get built. You have to have one of these pipelines at least. You probably should have 2 or 3 of them. You got to have one for sure. And Trans Mountain looks like it's it. John Horgan, if the taps were turned off, my sense is John Horgan would wrap himself in the BC flag and, Alberta's being so mean to us and nasty and illegal and all this stuff. But truthfully, Jason Kenney and the Albertans could just as easily say, John Horgan is being un-Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's one. Even if people in Vancouver are furious with Jason Kenney for turning off the taps and causing what will be very real hardship and economic pain, that's fine. They can't vote for or against him. They might plausibly get angry at somebody who Kenney will be pointing at, saying, quite plausibly, we didn't start this fight. We plan on finishing it, make no mistake, but, we wouldn't be doing this if we weren't provoked by a provincial government that said they would, use every tool in the toolbox to stop this project. There's a really great piece in the National Post this morning by Tristan Hopper. We've mentioned him on this podcast before. He's an Edmonton-based writer, and his take on the provincial election was, the really dangerous conclusion that's going to come out of this is that Rachel Notley tried really, really hard to play nice with the environmental movement, shutting down coal plants, bringing in a carbon tax, and working with the oil industry on a number of other measures that got a lot less reporting. And what happened is the environmental movement still said double middle fingers to you.
Yeah. There's no placating them, for sure.
Well, exactly. So, like, it's quite reasonable then, or understandable at least, for somebody like Jason Kenney to come in and capitalize on sort of growing unease and even anger at a completely uncompromising environmental movement. So, eventually, there's going to have to be some sort of pragmatic horse trading, or it's just going to become brinkmanship.
Yeah, think of Gordon Campbell bringing in the first carbon tax in North America, and yes, Sephora Berman and those guys got on board briefly. And, it made it confusing enough for the 2009 election that lefty vote split. But as soon as Gordon Campbell, as soon as that passed, they were gone. They started beating them up for other things. And, this is the fallacy, frankly, for the center-right, is we think that we can logically reason with these ideologues about issues. That if we just make the right case. I hear this all the time working for the ICBA, where we're dealing with the fallout of John Horgan giving unions a monopoly on public construction. Well, if we just sat down with John Horgan, if we just sat down with Melanie Mark and explained to them all the wonderful training and apprenticeships that the private sector do and the non-union firms do, they'll come to their senses and they'll realize how foolish they're being. No, like, these guys are rabid ideologues. And, you're never going to convince them. So, the only way to stop union-only hiring, the only way to stop, this obstruction to the pipeline is, frankly, to vote the bums out.
I mean, in a generation, we may well give Rachel Notley, to be quite frank, more credit for doing things like phasing out coal power in Alberta, which, I mean, we here in BC with our almost completely emissions-free hydro don't even think about this. But in Alberta, where they don't have mountain rivers, they've been relying on coal since the beginning of time. And so, like, this is a major accomplishment. This is a big achievement. And I think she deserves more credit for it. And what did she get instead? Absolutely nothing in return. Yeah. And believe me, politicians across the country, and I think people across the country, were paying very close attention.
Yeah, well, actually, we should talk about that. So a couple of themes that came out in this campaign that I think will be interesting watching federally and then I think provincially in BC. First of all, Rachel Notley, despite being, like, everything about Notley's brand is positivity, freshness. She's new, the first NDP premier, broke 40 years of conservative rule in Alberta. She was really Davy Barrett. Their Davy Barrett. I think she in her heart of hearts knew she was there for a good time, not a long time. They ran a campaign that was all about smearing UCP candidates and smearing them for things from years past that, smearing them for social conservative stands, which, right or wrong, there are, a big enclave of people, even in British Columbia, who hold those, hold different beliefs from Rachel Notley. And really, like, hard went after them. I mean, that Charles Adler interview with Jason Kenney, like, why won't he dump this guy? Well, the guy apologized and, he said that his views have changed. And, frankly, society's views have changed. Let's not forget Barack Obama himself ran in 2012 opposing same-sex marriage. Views change. My views have changed on the issue. Many people's views have changed on the issue. That's okay. That's growth. And instead of applying that evolution, the Notley campaign went really hard on that fear and smear, trying to replicate the Lake of Fire, Wild Rose collapse. I don't think I see little hints of Trudeau, not even little hints, major hints of Trudeau doing the same thing against Andrew Scheer, trying to paint him as like an alt-right, rabid, white nationalist. I mean, you spend 30 seconds in a room with Andrew Scheer, you can see he's not that guy. Like, it just doesn't fit the narrative. And frankly, Trudeau, for all his sunny ways, isn't the right sales guy like Rachel Notley to try to go to a fear and smear campaign. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, except that it was a failed campaign tactic and one that I think the other side should really think long and hard about using again.
Well, it didn't work in Alberta for a number of reasons. One of which you touched on is that the NDP, for reasons we can get into, but decided to make this issue about this election about social issues. The Conservatives were talking about the economy, and I think really they were running sort of almost two parallel campaigns that weren't even talking about the same things. And when these things happen, as people like Bill Clinton have observed, the economy will always win because it's everyone's sole concern. And then obviously social issues are important, but the economy has to come first, or at least it does in most people's minds. The other thing that didn't work in Alberta, and this may not apply federally, is that the NDP and their supporters, especially online, were talking about the Conservatives coming in like it was this big, hypothetical, unthinkable thing, which, I mean, there's nowhere in Canada where that's less true than Alberta. Where, I mean, they were there just 4 years ago, guys. I mean, surely you remember it wasn't, there was no lake of fire. And so, I mean, acting as though, the Chicken Little Act really didn't work in Alberta because people understood, and they may not have liked it, but they understood what life was like under a Conservative government. And, you don't have to like the Conservatives to realize that some of those fears were maybe a little overblown.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they kept attacking Jason Kenney like he was some stranger that no one in Alberta knew. The guy's been an Alberta politician for 2 decades, and before that, led the largest advocacy group in Alberta. So, he was a known quantity to all these folks.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. And so, I mean, against, Joe Smith, the fictitious MLA Conservative leader from High River, maybe. But even then, the Conservative brand name in Alberta is still the single most popular one. Look, the NDP, like you say, they knew they were there for one term, because if Kenney or anyone else succeeded in uniting that one party, the NDP won a majority government with something like 40% of the vote, and the other two parties had over 55. And it's a pretty simple story. Last election they were split. This election they were joined, and the support didn't go anywhere. So I mean, it's actually incredibly simple electoral math.
Yeah, and that's the second lesson to take from this is, look, Conservative governments only lose when their vote splits. In British Columbia, the BC Conservative Party took just enough votes in Courtney Comox and in Mark Dalton's riding in Maple Ridge to knock those two out. Those two win. Darryl Plecas doesn't defect. There's a bunch of, there's a pretty good, a decent Liberal majority, and who knows, maybe Christy Clark is even still premier. Like that, the left only has enough power when the center-right splits. So if you're a BC Liberal these days, and frankly, if you're a BC Conservative, one of those few folks, you should really be looking and thinking to yourself, look, it's one thing, like if you're a BC Conservative, yeah, okay, I don't love the BC Liberals, but is it better than having John Horgan in power? Hell yeah.
Well, I mean, that's it exactly. I mean, there's always going to be some compromise. And I mean, even if you are on the, far right of the economic or hell, the social spectrum, I promise you, even the, a BC Conservative or Maxime Bernier's party, there's going to be a couple issues where you disagree. You're going to compromise somewhere. I promise you not everyone in the NDP agrees with absolutely everything the party's doing in government. I can tell you that for a fact. But again, they feel that party best represents sort of the broader spectrum of their values and priorities, and good for them. And it's the same with any party on the right or center right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so Jason Kenney has said Bill 1 will be repealing the carbon tax in Alberta. Frankly, I think that actually will have to be Bill 2. I think Bill 1, they have to, reaffirm the supremacy of Parliament, don't they?
Yes.
Is that the usual Bill 1?
Well, he said that, to be fair, there's a couple things he said he was going to do first, which is what these things happen on election campaigns. It's not even a criticism. There's that. There's the I think it was Bill 12, which was Notley's bill to potentially turn off the taps. That was going to be job 1, but also job 1 was going to be a public inquiry into foreign funding and influence on domestic election campaigns. That will be we're going to talk about this more later, but that will be very, very, very closely watched here in BC, because there are direct ramifications here and across the country, really.
Yeah, that sound you hear is Ellis Ross yelling, "Amen!" But we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that in a second. The Notley legacy, we talked a little bit about that. Look, she'll go down in history as the first, maybe the only NDP premier of Alberta. You do wonder if they'll follow the BC pattern. I mean, you had Davy Barrett from 72 to 75, and then no NDP government again until 91 when, coincidentally, the vote split, the center-right vote split. So, you do wonder if you're going to get 2, 3, 4 more terms of Conservative government before the NDP can redraw. The electoral map for the NDP it's a terrible, like, you look at it, and Alberta is just completely blue except for this little speck in Edmonton.
Well, yeah, and I mean, they've done a good job carving out a stronghold in Edmonton. But I mean, here's how I think we're going to remember Rachel Notley in a generation. If I'm originally from Calgary, and I grew up in Alberta politics, and if you told me that the party that was going to eventually upend the Progressive Conservatives was the NDP, I mean, I would have bet a lot of money against that. And that's not because of a personal feeling. It's just the NDP were so far down below I mean, even the Alberta Liberals, or I would have thought that some sort of third party would have come out of nowhere and done it. And that almost happened with the Wild Rose. But so what Notley's been able to do with a brand that is only ever going to have fairly limited appeal in Alberta, it's what she did is remarkable. I mean, we're going to have to give her credit. I mean, I think even Jason Kenney has been pretty clear. He admires Rachel Notley and what she's been able to accomplish electorally.
Yeah.
Now, her vision didn't work, and that's fine. She tried. That's all you can ask. No, but, I mean, in terms of what she's managed to accomplish as a politician, I mean, my hat's off to her.
One last piece. Trudeau, well, the Alberta Liberals, I think, got 1%, less than 1% of the vote. It was the most dismal showing in their history. Trudeau has been firmly not invited to go campaign in Prince Edward Island, where he has MP seats. Where's Justin Trudeau going to go this fall on his campaign tour if he's not welcome in Alberta? And I'm not sure he's particularly welcome in British Columbia. I'm not sure Ontario is thrilled to see him. I'm not sure PEI wants him anymore. Is he just going to hang around Gatineau? Is that the plan for Justin Trudeau?
You'll see a lot of him in Quebec because I think the SNC-Lavalin story, I don't think it hurts them there. And the other thing is there's a lot of seats up for grabs in Quebec because Jagmeet Singh is not popular, and the party is not popular in Quebec, and there are a number of seats there in play. And they also have to protect what has sort of become their home turf in Atlantic Canada. So I think that you will quite rightly see you will see a lot more of Justin Trudeau on the East Coast than the West Coast. I mean, he'll come through here. They have some seats in and around Metro Vancouver that are still in play, and there's a couple here, there, and everywhere in the prairies. But no, I mean, for them, this election is going to be about protecting Atlantic Canada and making gains in Quebec.
Yeah. Well, good luck to you. Good luck to you, Prime Minister. All right, the back burner. Little scoop on the Orca. They're finally going to be serving beer and wine in the Pacific Buffet. Now, Maclean, I'm a Sea West Lounge guy, so I'm not sure I'm thrilled about this, but tell us how that little story evolved, and are you surprised? Like, there's been a lot of negative reaction on Twitter to this idea of BC Ferries serving alcohol.
Yeah, there's been some negative reaction, but to be honest, I'm seeing more positive reaction. There's a lot more sort of like good than there is. There's been a lot of hand-wringing from people that I really like and respect. So, I mean, I'm not going to criticize, but, to me, it's not a whole lot different than a restaurant that has a parking lot. I mean, not everyone on the BC Ferry is driving, and not everyone is even in a car. I didn't get a chance to chat with BC Ferries about this specifically, but I'd be very curious to know if they have any idea what percentage of people on a given ferry are actually driving themselves. It's probably less. It's almost certainly less than half. And so, we're talking about a single beer or wine up to a maximum of 2, which you can have only with a meal. Right. It's something they're trying, and this is something that's got lost, I think, a little. This is a pilot project. It's only on one route and on 3 vessels only. And so you're going to have to watch your the schedule very closely to make sure you're on one of those sailings where they're trying it. So like they're it's a terrible pun, but they're sticking their toe in the water to see if they can make this work.
Shame on you for that pun, Maclean. That's
it was terrible.
I had a laugh at Jody Emery tweeted to me when I posted a link to the story that what about marijuana? Jody has a one-track advocacy mind. I pointed out that it took nearly 100 years after Prohibition ended to get these 2 drinks into the Pacific Buffet. So I'm calculating the year 2118, we'll see marijuana lounges on BC Ferries.
Well, I mean, if you've ever been on the upper deck, it's often the marijuana lounge, whether it's allowed to be or not. And here's the thing. I mean, Jody has a point, but I mean, if you set aside concerns with impairment, which are the same with marijuana, or at least similar as there would be with a single beer, there are a lot more people who are offended by secondhand marijuana smoke than are by the aroma of somebody drinking beer. So I mean, it's not a perfect comparison, but I'm prepared to say that Jody is not 100% wrong, and eventually there's going to be some movement there too, I'm sure.
The price point on the beer and wine will be fascinating.
Yes. Because there won't be any like discount selections. It's like they specifically said it's going to be, BC beer and wine, and my applause to them for that, by the way. Yeah. But it also means that there won't be, your cheap Molson Canadian option.
Yes. All right. Well, that's good. Hey, by the way, talking with Jody Emery, marijuana, this 420 thing, it's like all they can talk about over here on talk radio. It's frankly, I find it sort of boring. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit too libertarian to care, but. This is a parks board that allows beer gardens, that allows all sorts of crazy events to happen, that sometimes turns a blind eye to other crazy events. This is a city that had a critical mass bike protest that went on for years with, tying up the downtown,
that's right,
and never policing it. And yet now, all of a sudden, I don't know if it's the size and scale of 420 or what, but man, people are bent out of shape about this.
Well, and it's one of those things that the more you look into it, the more you sort of see both sides kind of have a point. Jody Vance's piece in the Orca yesterday is fantastic. I mean, she's saying essentially that you're both right about different things, and we have a year to get this right for next year to figure out something that works for everybody. But I mean, yeah, you're 100% right in that the city does look the other way on a lot of other events and protests and festivals, and the city's also 100% right when they say, yeah, you know what, 420, you say you pay for it, but you don't. The total bill is just not the same thing, and we do have to close the beach for, I think they said between 4 and 6 weeks afterwards for cleanup. I mean, that's not missing out on a park for a day. That's a month.
I think they're lying about that because I've seen pictures from the next day. I've seen pictures from the next day, and the place looks fairly clean. And
well, you're probably right. And as I say, I don't live in Vancouver, so I mean, I only know what I can glean from the trustworthy Parks Board. But the point is that they're both sides. At the very least, you can see the point on either side, and hopefully we can sit down and I don't mean we. I hope eventually the city and the 420 organizers can sit down and work out something, because this should be a big event. I mean, I'm not a cannabis user, but Cypress Hill's cool, man. Like that sounds like that doesn't sound like a terrible day.
Oh boy, let's not get crazy here. I don't want to be accused of fake news by saying Cypress Hill is cool. No, yeah, the 420 thing will continue on. I remember like a few years ago, like this is how far they've come. A few years ago, someone took a high-res photo of the event from across the water, and it was like just this wall of people. But the photo was posted on Reddit in such a high-res way that you could actually zoom in and make out people's faces. And this was a big privacy concern for a lot of the protesters there because, geez, I don't really want my boss to know that I snuck out of work to go to 420. Fortunately, 420 this year for those folks is on a Saturday, so there should not be as many work skippers. All right. Who is heating up, politicians or leaders who are having a good week? And Maclean, if I had asked you the name of the Premier of New Brunswick, would you be able to tell me who that is?
If I'm being honest, no. It's not Frank McKenna.
No, it's not Frank McKenna. It's not Bernard Lord. It's also not Brian Gallant anymore. It is Blaine Higgs. He is a progressive conservative. He's holding together a minority government there with a party called the People's Alliance, who coincidentally have 3 seats. A minority government propped up by 3 seats. Where have I heard that story before? But here's the thing. I want to bring some attention to New Brunswick and a little bit of applause. New Brunswick's debt clock is actually ticking backwards. Unlike the rest of these provinces that continue to tick up, including British Columbia, which has had a balanced budget for years and yet have added tens of billions of dollars in debt. The NDP, by the way, projecting to add $400 million of debt every single month for the next 3 years, and yet we claim that they are wonderful financial stewards. New Brunswick's is legit ticking backwards. They've made some spending cuts. They've reprioritized some spending, changed some other things. And it's hard to believe because most minority governments spend more, not less.
That's true. And also, can we at least touch on the name of his party? The People's Alliance might be the most generic
People's Alliance
name. The People's Alliance.
I think, isn't that what the rebels are trying to defeat in Star Wars?
Yeah, probably. It's one of those things it's kind of brilliant because you could talk yourself into thinking it's either left wing or right wing. But yeah, no, you're 100% right. And guys like Blaine Higgs aren't going to get nearly enough credit. And this kind of work is hard to do, and it takes a long time. These are long-term things, paying down debt, and so it's it takes a patient and principled politician to at least even point in that direction. And we don't have nearly enough of that in this country right now.
Yeah, my old friends at the Taxpayers Federation, they have debtclock.ca where you can actually go, you can look at every provincial and federal debt clock, and you can actually plug in your favorite date, birth date if you want, to see what the debt was then and how far it's come since then. I'll give you a little hint. It's almost never good news, but New Brunswick ticking downward. Maclean, back to Alberta. Who do you think's hot?
Well, we don't know the name of this person yet, and we touched on this earlier, so I won't spend too long on it. But whoever Premier Jason Kenney appoints to head the inquiry into foreign funding and foreign-funded organizations that influence Canadian elections and campaigning, that person is going to be incredibly important, because this is something that, quite frankly, at least deserves some examination. And maybe we'll find out that it's not that big a deal. I think that we're going to find something a little different than that. But this is going to be very closely watched from coast to coast, because it's not just happening in Alberta. In fact, it's happening on a very large scale here in BC. So, some of those organizations that Kenney mentioned by name in his speech, Lead Now, the Tides Foundation, they will at the very least be watching this very, very, very closely.
Yeah, did you see which one was it? Was it Tides? Or someone came out and said they're looking for a compliance officer? Which got a lot of play on Twitter. It is interesting. Like, I'm not sure who the right appointee is for that position, right? Obviously, Vivian Krause is going to have a lot of influence as far as the research side. People like Alice Ross will probably want to make presentations since they've done a lot of research into this. I'm not sure British Columbia's the right person to appoint to that panel from an Alberta point of view. There are some folks who worked for the Yes campaign in the TransLink referendum who I know who were shocked at how organized and well-resourced a lot of these environmental groups were during that campaign. They would have some interesting perspectives to share. But, I'm not sure, like, do you get a judge, a retired judge or someone? Is it someone with a little bit of political background? Is it a Brian Jean? Would that be a good appointment? Like, he's a pretty even-handed guy. I'll be curious to see, like you say, who Kenney appoints to lead this thing.
If she wasn't just made an independent Liberal senator in Ottawa, I would have said someone like Paula Simons, who is prominent in Edmonton, which would be important for Kenney right now to start building bridges in that city. But obviously she's busy now. But I think for this issue, he'll want somebody who's got some sort of centrist credibility, because I think it'll be a little too easy for groups like Lead Now and Tides to roll their eyes at Brian Jean, seems like a respected guy in Alberta. It was a Wild Rose leader. And so if they have somebody who's sort of on the other side of the PC spectrum, that might go over a little better. But without having a better understanding of who Kenney sort of has at his fingertips there, we're just guessing. Yeah.
Also in Kenney staffing, don't be surprised if you see one or more British Columbians end up working for him. I think Maclean and I may both have heard the same rumor about one of them, but we'll talk off air because I don't want to out that person.
Indeed, yes. We have heard the same rumor, and no, we won't talk about it live.
So sorry, folks. Something's still on background. All right.
We're staying here.
So my cold politician right now, I'm going to give it to Carol James, and here's why. So we've been saying a lot at ICB, winter is coming to the BC economy. BC budget projects housing starts to drop by a third over the next couple of years. But here's a frightening stat, and thanks to Bob Price and the Orca Business Beat. I wish I could do a Bob Price impression. That guy's voice is fantastic, eh?
You can't imitate it. I've tried. Yeah. It's too natural and too deep and too resonant.
Bob Price for the Orca Business Report. There's Jordan Bateman with the Orca High Pitch Business Report. Retail sales in February were down 1.9% in British Columbia. Okay, that's bad news as it is. You want retail sales to be at least even or to be growing in order to continue to generate the sales tax revenue and other revenues that you expect. Here's even more frightening. It was down 1.9% in BC. We were the only province that saw a downturn in February. The rest of the country saw increases of 0.9 to 2.2%. And it's actually worse in Vancouver. 1.9% down in BC, 3.5% down in Vancouver.
Wow.
So this is bad news for Carol James because her budget models do not anticipate any kind of downturn in retail sales. In fact, she expects them to strengthen. Maybe this is just a 1 month blip. I will note that in the Vancouver number, it's down 3.5% from January, but it's also down 3% year over year, February to February. So, if retail sales, that's a good sign of consumer confidence. If consumer confidence is starting to evaporate, you do wonder, will you be able to hit those sales tax targets? It's bad news for a government that relies so heavily on tax revenue if consumers stop spending.
Well, and they were very explicit that their projections depended on continued growth, and that is for whatever you thought of Mike DeYoung before, he was a little more conservative, small c conservative, in his economic projections and tried to play it safe. Maybe sometimes too safe, but the NDP have chose to go another way, and there's danger ahead.
Exactly. All right, and then cold. We're going back to Alberta. It's always cold in Alberta.
Well, this time of year, and we touched on this, but I mean, the leaders of the two third parties there, if that makes sense, Stephen Mandel of the Alberta Party, who is a former mayor of Edmonton, and is it David Kahn is the Alberta Liberal leader, and both respected guys in Alberta politics, but I mean, in a province where
you didn't mention Derek Fildebrandt in the line, respected politician in Alberta.
You're right. I'm sorry. That's right. You're right. It's my bad. That's three party leaders all shut out. Their parties all shut out. There are only two parties in the Alberta legislature. Look, there is probably not room for five parties in Alberta where the governing party gets 55% of the vote. That's just not enough real estate to go around. And we mentioned before, the NDP have very deep and locked in support in Edmonton, and that just doesn't leave anywhere else.
Yeah, where's the Green Party in Alberta?
It doesn't exist.
God, I love that province, Alberta.
Well, it's funny, this is true. Not a lot of people know this. Before Elizabeth May took over as leader of the federal Greens, the previous leader's name was Jim Harris. Alberta was the place that they did best across the country. And they saw as sort of like this is true. And this is a place they saw as sort of like as their natural spot they might make a breakthrough for two reasons. They were speaking federally. Yeah. They didn't see, this is 15 years ago now, but they didn't see any potential for a Liberal NDP or any other party to break through federally. So if eventually some Albertan wanted an option, the Greens were a real option. And of course, back then, the Greens were a lot more pragmatic. They weren't a lot, under Elizabeth May, they've gotten into a lot more sort of, worrying about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, that kind of thing. They used to be a lot more sort of what they called rancher green, about conservation, and which are things that went over well in Alberta, and as they do everywhere. But the Greens have since gone another direction and got themselves a beachhead here on Vancouver Island, and have gone down to below 5% nationally. It's
boom times for the Greens, I guess. There you go. All right.
Well, nationally, they have not done well. There's no getting around that.
No. I think the lasting memory for most Canadians of Elizabeth May is being pulled off stage by, was it Lisa Raitt who pulled her off stage at the?
Was Lisa Raitt.
Yeah, Lisa Raitt. All right, that is it for the Hot Stove. You can follow us on Twitter at the Orca BC. He's at Maclean K, correct?
That is right.
All right, at Jordan Bateman. You can follow us at facebook.com/theorcabc. We're going to be back next Thursday. Just some programming notes. No Finn over the weekend, correct?
That's right. We'll see you back on Tuesday. And listen to CKNW today at 2 p.m. where Mike Smith and I are going to be talking about booze on ferries.
Oh, I hope there's lots of sound effects of you guys clinking glasses and popping champagne corks. Monday content, just so you know, Off the Cluff will be back. He has an interview with Shelley Gudgeon, am I saying that? The former Victoria City Councillor, and frankly, owner of Rick's favorite restaurant in Victoria. I happened to sit in on this interview while it was going on, and the pre-interview was about twice as long and involved Rick begging Shelley for all the recipes from La Trattoria.
Il Terrazzo.
Oh, Il Terrazzo, sorry.
Yeah, which, if you're here in Victoria, the praise is justified. It's fantastic.
It's magnifique. I don't know, that's not Italian, but there you go. But we will have that up on Monday and then back for Hot Stove on Thursday.
Looking forward to it. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Take care.